David is a well-known person, splendid biographer of Patrick White, wonderful book on asylum seekers, which I want to discuss with him tonight, Dark Victory, many other things. He has, you'll be aware, written a quarterly essay on Dear Mr. Rudd. Readers often think that a thing that they're reading was written the moment before they are reading it. David wrote at a time when either the Rudd government and the Prime Minister was very popular, or he was just slightly declining in popularity. It really, I have to say, is a prophetic essay in that you wrote it and then he, as it were, conveniently proved you right, to many of our dismay. The second thing I want to say is and this is, I've got to the age when I just actually you always say what I believe. It is, I think, the best essay and the best piece that's been written on the Rudd government, and certainly the Prime Minister. Point two.
Thank you, Robert.
Third point is, however, I think that the reason that it's been so taken up, in part, is because of its weakest element, which is its analysis of the character of the Prime Minister, or at least its claim about the relationship of his childhood to his present and to his ideology and to his anger. And I mean, some of you will have watched Q&A last Monday, and I must say I slightly agreed with your antagonist, the female psychiatrist, in that
we'll get to that.
So this is my provocative opening. What I'd like you to do is to defend really your psychological portrait, which, to put it simply, says that a young boy living up country Queensland loses his father tragically, is treated maybe badly, maybe not, by those who own the farm, and is so disoriented by this experience that in a way it fuels him, gives him a kind of rage which he goes into politics to somehow do something about. I mean, that may be unfair, but that's my reading.
It's a boiled-down reading, golly, I'm going to be a bit circuitous in my answer. When I, years ago, was writing about Patrick White, the Freudian biography was all the rage. And biography was said to be, at that time, by many people, valueless unless it was a Freudian study of the development of the subject, with Freudian language. And I argued passionately against that. I thought it was completely bogus. And bogus for some of the reasons that my antagonist on Q&A said the other night. This man is not on your couch. You cannot diagnose him with any kind of scientific clarity, and I agree with her. However, one of the survival mechanisms of the human race is that we try to work out how other people operate, how they think and behave. It's one of the ways societies work. We all do it, we do it all the time. Journalists do it a great deal of the time, and biographers rather make a specialty of it. But I believe it needs to be done discreetly and carefully. And with my examination of Rudd, I clutch rather strongly onto the fact that his life fulfills an interesting pattern. I'm not pretending that I've discovered a one-off here. In fact, nearly everything about Rudd's character, what's good and what's bad, is present in most politicians in different measures. He's interesting to me because of the weightings various aspects of his character have, but I don't use psychiatric language, and I am careful about my conclusions. And one of the people I trust most about Rudd's character is Rudd. And Rudd talks about the origins of his politics being the experience of his childhood. And Rudd talks about the impact of his father's death, the expulsion from the farm, and then the 2 terrible years he spent in a Catholic boarding school. He talks about the way in which that has shaped the passions of his politics and his career. I rely very much on the subject himself. As for the anger, there's a great deal of evidence for it. The fact that he lost his block with me is not completely remarkable. What's a bit unusual is that I wrote about it. Politicians lose their blocks with journalists all the time. In fact, the other night, Tony Jones told me about an occasion, I can't remember whether it was late in the time that Rudd was leader of the opposition or early in the time he was in government, where Rudd simply wouldn't let him out of a studio and just went him for 20 minutes in what sounds like the same kind of performance he did for me. I'm lucky I don't live and work in Canberra. I don't have to ever darken Rudd's doorstep again. I went, I wrote about him, and I came back, and that's it as far as I'm concerned. That's it. Other journalists have to deal with and live with politicians. So outbursts of rage don't much get written about. Keating's did in the end because they were so astonishingly flamboyant. The telephone calls from Keating were experiences that some people came to actually welcome because they were performances. That was the sort of Cirque du Soleil of politicians' anger. But I've written about it. I'm as convinced as I sit here as I was sitting in front of Rudd on that terrace in Mackay, that it is when he is angry that you see the real man. Now, there's a great deal more to the man than anger, and I don't believe that anger disqualifies anybody from public life. But that is, I think, when you see the real man with the mask slipping.
I mean, I don't want to conduct an argument about it.
Go ahead.
No, because
it's a windy, cold night, and people have come for entertainment.
Time is limited, and there are lots of other things to say. I mean, I just say this, that what I don't doubt that he said to you, and indeed I believe it to almost certainly true, that the experience he had as a young fellow made him interested in social welfare and the idea that the welfare state is a good thing. It actually was what happened to me. My father died at roughly the same age, and I know that the fact that there were people helping us as a family, strangers coming to Jewish refugees, giving us help, had an enormous effect on making me think about the welfare state differently from neoliberals. I don't doubt any of that. What I suppose I'm a bit sceptical about is the connection between that, which is Rudd's account of much of his political passion, and this sort of psychological rage which you encounter in him. I mean, all I think is when I think about people that I know, indeed when I think about myself, what drives us all, I think, is quite mysterious and rather difficult to fathom. And that's why I'm slightly sympathetic to the idea that you have to get to know someone exceedingly well before before the real pattern of their drives becomes clear. And what really is going on, usually I think in the very early years of their life, becomes clear to us. So that's my scepticism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing for me is that Rudd is part of a pattern of political leaders who when young, lose their fathers. I'm fascinated by that pattern. I talk about the pattern in the essay. Yes. And I rely to some extent on the work that has been done by people who have examined that pattern and the impact it has on those people. And as well as, I mean, to lose your father in the way that Rudd lost his father, and then to have an astonishingly strong drive to power, appear to be connected by experience of many other people. The religiosity of the man is another aspect of that. And another aspect of it is dealing very poorly with other human beings, and particularly the ones that you work with. Now, I don't know whether any of those qualities have emerged in you, Robert, as a result of your own experience, but you've not driven yourself to high office. But the pattern as well is there. But you know,
I haven't had a fight in 30-something years at my university, as a matter of fact.
Well, Rudd is astonishingly disliked by those who have worked closely with him for any length of time.
Can I take up the religiosity part of it? Again, when I read his essay, Faith and Politics, which was published in the Monthly, I, to my shame now in a way, became a Ruddite, in that we were living in the days of the desert of John Howard, when no one spoke like that on either side of politics. And here was a man speaking from the Sermon on the Mount as to how one should have policy for asylum seekers and climate change.
But it was a good essay too. It was intelligent. It was beautifully argued.
I've come to doubt it, but I mainly wanted to get your take on it. My doubt is partly that, and it comes from Max Weber, who wrote a wonderful essay called Politics as a Vocation, and I reread it recently to check this, and he said that anyone who thinks that day-to-day politics can be built upon the Sermon on the Mount, uses the Sermon on the Mount, is an infant. And I mean, it's a very hard realist position, but nevertheless, there's something in the essay when I went back to it recently that made me worried, and it is to do with that there's a sort of, in my view, there's a kind of disconnect between the high-blown rhetoric, Christian moral rhetoric of Rudd, and his openness to the kind of New South Wales right, to the hard-nosed, pragmatic politics, as if he hasn't connected his values properly with political practice. I just wondered what...
I absolutely agree. I'm not one of those people who believes Rudd has no values and believes nothing, and look at how he's turned out. A man who turns out like that couldn't have meant any of the things that he said. I think indeed he did mean the things he said, but as I argue in the essay, he has failed spectacularly to deliver according to the Christian values that he himself talked about. He talked about the values that would inform his politics, and he talked, for instance, while leader of the opposition, he said he would have no part of any government that resiled in any way from our full obligations under the Vienna Conventions towards refugees. No part. The failure is spectacular. Perhaps we'll get to that in a minute. But just on the role of religion, here is me arguing for my discretion, because I can't prove this, but this is what is in my mind about people who flaunt their religion in public life. Religion makes people feel really wonderful about themselves. That's the role of religion very often in public life. You feel great about yourself. You feel that you have a connection to the infinite. Now, that's there, got that in the essay. But you feel as though that what you are doing has gets the greatest approval of all, the approval of our Lord. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very sceptical about religion in public life, because it's essentially a feel-good thing. And in Rudd's case, it certainly has, and I don't know whether it makes Rudd feel good. It certainly makes him feel that he has connection to the infinite, but it has not served him at all as a source of values that he's willing to defend in the political hurly-burly of government. And here is this fascinating contradiction about Rudd. Rudd sold himself to the public as the kind of man who wrote that essay in the Monthly, and I believe he is those things. But he sold himself to the party as a relentless and skillful fighter in big brawls. He sold himself to the party because of the magnificent job he did attacking the government over AWB. That's why the New South Wales people decided to break with Beazley and back him in a caucus push as leader of the opposition, because they didn't think Beazley was doing a good enough job fighting work choices. They thought this other guy, the Queensland man, was a man who could do a better job of making sure that Howard was destroyed over work choices. And that's what happened. So the party put him in because of a set of qualities, and the public voted him in for a completely different set of qualities. And when the government began, those two sets of qualities came into direct collision. And his backers, let me tell you, in New South Wales, in Sussex Street in New South Wales, they don't give a flying whatever for global warming. They think it is a ridiculous moral distraction. to the real business of government, which is staying in power. And Rudd has, in the end, gone with his backers against his own better nature and has essentially busted his own brand.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things about that. I was going to intervene, but I didn't get into it.
Didn't give you a chance,
didn't give me a chance. I mean, I actually think your account of Christianity and politics is a bit one-sided. I mean, many Christians and many religious people, but particularly Christians, feel that they are sinners, feel that God is watching them, but watching them harshly all the time. And Calvinists, who are the worst of this, wait for all the signs that they are saved, but they believe in basically that they're damned.
In their heart of hearts, they're going to burn.
That's right. And so I think religion is a bit more complex, or Christianity is a bit more complex psychologically than you say. It can be, as you say, that one is good and God is looking favourably upon one. Maybe a lot of Americans, to be unfair, do think like that, but I think a deeply religious person doesn't. Now, but I mean, I suppose we agree on the fundamental point that Bonhoeffer into Habib don't go.
No.
You can't be both. You choose one or the other. And I think the problem with Rudd, in a way, is that he hasn't been able to choose one or the other. He somehow hoped that he could retain the moral integrity of someone who took their bearings from the great anti-Nazi hero. On the other hand, while listening on a daily basis to Sussex Street, in your case. And I thought, I mean, we're now jumping and I'll go back to other things, but I thought when he gave in on the ETS and said we won't do it for 3 or 4 years, or 3 years, whatever, I think he looked shattered. Not because the polls were down, but because the Bonhoeffer and Habib part of him had collided finally. He'd taken the decision on clever advice, get it off the agenda. But I think he knows in his heart that if he stands for anything, it's for the fight of climate change. You begin with vivid passages of what he was like in Copenhagen, where he worked 25 hours a day to try and bring it about. So I wondered if you think there's something in that it's been a shattering experience for him, for the two parts of his kind of political and personal being to come apart. It
is said that he has been shattered by the public response, because it appears, and I don't have first-hand knowledge of this, but it appears that the kind of hard-nosed advice in Canberra, led by the New South Wales people, was that because of the efflorescence last year, particularly, of the climate deniers. I mean, the climate deniers were just getting this spectacular run everywhere. And because the polling was showing that the people were going a bit soft on climate change, and because, of course, the dreadful problems of this Senate for this government, which must never be overlooked in any of the critique of Rudd, the uniquely difficult Senate he has to deal with, and a uniquely obstructive leader of the opposition, that dumping ETS in this way was sensible and wouldn't be much missed by the public. And I think if Rudd is shattered, as I understand it, he's shattered because he held out for a very long time against dumping it, was finally swayed by Habib and Wayne Swan to dump it, and was astonished by the public's response.
That's interesting.
The response of the public has caught them unawares.
Yes. Can I take you back to something I did want to raise with you? And it's something that's not in the essay much, and it's something that I wondered what you thought about. And that is, my personal view is that the political culture shifted under John Howard, and I think we fought many similar battles during those years.
I was only ever a reporter, Robert.
I was only ever a scholar. And I think a poison was kind of introduced to the country in many ways on many issues, or maybe that's too strong, but something unpleasant. What isn't in your essay, and this is, I think, partly will help explain Rudd to future generations, is how one copes after that period, if one is a sort of Bonhoeffer man, as I think he is. In other words, you don't seem to me to account for the difficulty of someone coming in after a period of such cynicism, such a kind of retreat from the more hopeful values of the period from Whitlam through Fraser to Hawke and Keating. So I just wondered if there's an element there of Rudd, as it were, having to cope with that kind of conservative populism on all sorts of issues.
I don't see it that way, you see. I think the astonishing popularity that Rudd enjoyed from the moment he became leader of the opposition was a mark of the community's wish to put the worst of the Howard years behind us, and that they didn't represent a challenge or a difficulty. In fact, it represented an opportunity, and that much of the way in which Rudd sold himself in that year before he became Prime Minister was, he took some of the qualities of Howard, and particularly on sort of economic affairs and on social policy. The two are virtually indistinguishable, questions of marriage and things like that. But by promising to bring back truthfulness above all, and the Bonhoeffer essay, in my view, is essentially about truthfulness and about the willingness of a man to martyr himself for the truth. In Bonhoeffer's case, in fact, I'm really, really intrigued by Rudd's passion for martyrs. Bonhoeffer, Sir Thomas More, he studied A Man for All Seasons in his final year at school, and I think we are all marked by the texts we study in our final year at school. And I heard the other day that he was recently talking to somebody about how much he loved Caravaggio's depictions of the martyrdom of John the Baptist. Again, sort of martyrdom. I wonder sometimes whether his passion for Whitlam is a bit about martyrdom as well. Anyway, I said, martyrs.
So I'm making the case that
I don't think
political culture has shifted, and it's quite difficult.
I think the political culture was keen to shift back again.
Can I take up the issue that where we absolutely share values, but my political judgments are a bit different, which is asylum seekers. I'm of the view that given how Howard treated the issue and how well he did out of it, which your book with Marion Wilkinson is the best account and will be the definitive account, I'm of the view that it is very hard, it would be very hard for any Prime Minister now to deal with the asylum seeker issue. I've never been of the view that a Prime Minister can say to the Australian people, be generous, and they will. Certainly not after Howard. I think it's a really tough political question, and I think it is no accident. Two things. I think it's no accident that when they became more humane in their policies, boats returned, and they hadn't during the Pacific Solution. That's my view. And secondly, I think the politics of it now are very tough. I think it's absurd, like you do, and I think it's inhumane, like you do. But I also think politically it is very difficult in the post-Howard era for a government to cope with this issue, where 70% of people, or whatever...
66% of people would welcome the return of the Pacific Solution.
Yeah. Now, and I don't think that's an accident.
That defines failure. Yes.
But perhaps we could talk a little bit. I don't want to talk a lot about that, but because I think Rudd is in a difficult position with that issue, and I think he's failed because he didn't predict what his policies would bring about. But I wouldn't like to be advising him. I'm not sure how you would do it.
Well, this was one of the causes of Rudd's fury with me in Mackay.
This is 7:30 land stuff.
This is, well, sort of. I mean, he has spoken in the past so eloquently about the need to be humane to both people. He is absolutely aware of how trivial in numbers the problem is and how immense in political passions the problem is. He is also aware, and it speaks in a moving way, in a way that very few politicians do. He reminds Australians that the Geneva Conventions are about the Holocaust. They are the world's apology for the closing of doors at the Holocaust. Now, that's not something that Howard would ever talk about, and Rudd talks about it. He was talking about it only a week or so ago. He put into place a new policy which was said to be more humane, but it was based on the absurd notion that all of the processing should take place on a rock out in the Indian Ocean that had very limited capacity to deal with people. And I think he also approached I think the whole party approached the question of boat people in 2006, 2007, on the understanding that somehow the boats had gone away forever, and that they weren't going to come back. I mean, at the moment we're looking at a record arrival of people, of irregular arrivals by boat. Now, what I said to Rudd was, why don't you use your authority as Prime Minister, not to stand up and say, be kind or be generous, but to stand up and say, calm down, and to talk about the true scale of the problem, to try to teach people in Australia how small the problem is. You know, that we're talking about 25,000 people over 34 years. You know, those basic things. And he, on the record in the essay, he essentially says that he believed himself unable to influence public opinion on this issue. There's the Prime Minister telling me for publication that he is powerless to change the public's view on this issue. Now, later on... You
call him a spectator at the record.
Spectator at the wreckage, yeah. Mm. And later on, and unfortunately it's off the record and therefore I can't tell you what he said, but he certainly returned to the issue when he was ticking me off, and he returned to the issue very passionately. Mm. Now, I agree with you that it is a very difficult political issue, but my view is that it remains a very difficult political issue because both sides of politics use it when they wish. They know that under this country there is what I call a great artesian basin of racial disquiet, and if it suits them, they'll put a drill right down into it. And Labor did it under Howard. One Nation weren't the only people in 1999, 2000, early 2001 saying the Howard government had failed to discipline the arrival of boat people. Labor was doing it. They're up to their necks in it. And then, of course, that Tony Abbott is doing it now. I've tried to engage both leaders on the theology of this because both Rudd and Abbott talk about this in religious terms, talk about our obligations to boat people in religious terms, even though both, I think, in my view, are spectacularly error. But anyway, they talk about the Good Samaritan. And I've tried with Abbott and I've tried with Rudd up in Mackay to point out the second chapter of Matthew, what happened to Christ after his birth. The family fled to Egypt. For Christians, his mission on earth was only accomplished thanks to the generous refugee policies of the Egyptian government. I can't get up a discussion with either man on the second chapter of Matthew. I just can't.